I just need one chance. Sir, please. I just need one chance to work, the little girl said, her fingers gripping the cold iron bars of the gate. If you give me a chance, I can earn money, help my mom, and go back to school. I don't want anything for free. Daniel Carter remained just inside the gate, his posture straight, his expression controlled. He had already heard enough to understand the situation, or at least, he believed he had. You're too young, he said, his voice calm but firm. He raised his hand and pointed toward the notice posted beside him on the gate. Applicants must be of legal working age, prior experience required. The paper shifted slightly in the wind. That means adults, he continued. People with experience, not children. The girl followed his gesture, her eyes scanning the words before returning to him. I can learn, she said quietly. Daniel exhaled, already prepared to end the conversation. That's not the point. How old are you? 6. He nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. At your age, you should be in school, he said. Not out here asking for a job. I was in school, she replied. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. My mom, she can't afford the fees right now, the girl said, her voice steady but softer now, so I had to stop, just for now. He didn't respond. I want to go back, she continued. That's why I need to work. If I can help her, maybe things will get better. Daniel looked away briefly, toward the quiet street beyond the gate. You shouldn't have to fix that, he said. That's not your responsibility. The girl shook her head. It is, she replied. She's been trying for a long time. A pause. Then slowly she added, she used to have a job, a good one. Daniel's eyes returned to her. She worked for a company, the girl continued. A big one. She said the boss was strict, but fair. She trusted him. Something in Daniel's chest tightened just slightly. But the company went bankrupt, the girl said. Everything closed. She lost her job. Daniel didn't move. She tried to find work after that, the girl went on. Everywhere. Cleaning jobs, offices, stores, but nothing lasted. And things got harder. Her fingers tightened around the gate. That's why I want to help her now. The wind brushed softly between them. Daniel felt something shift, not yet recognition, but something close to it. What company? He asked. The question came out quicker than he intended. The girl blinked, a little surprised. Carter Tech Solutions, she said. That was the name. Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way most people would notice, but something behind his eyes tightened, sharpened. That's, he began, then stopped. His company. The one he had built. The one he had lost. Years ago, he took a step closer to the gate. What did you say your mother's name is? He asked, his voice lower now, more focused. The girl hesitated for a moment, then answered. Lena Brooks. Daniel froze. The name hit harder than anything else she had said. Lena Brooks. He hadn't heard it in years. Not since the day everything had collapsed. Not since employees had packed up their desks, one by one, carrying their lives out of a building that had once meant something. And Lena. She hadn't been just another employee. She had stayed longer than most, worked harder than most, believed longer than most. Daniel's hand tightened slightly at his side. You're her daughter? He asked. The girl nodded. Yes. Behind him, footsteps approached. Daniel? His wife's voice came again as she stepped closer, concern in her tone. What is it? He didn't answer right away. His gaze was still fixed on the girl. She said her mother worked at Carter Tech. Emily said softly, having caught enough of the conversation to understand. Daniel nodded once. Lena Brooks, he said. Emily's expression changed immediately. Oh, she breathed. I remember that name. The wind moved gently, stirring the edges of the hiring notice on the gate. Daniel looked back at the girl Annie, 6 years old, standing in the cold, asking for a chance, not knowing she had just reopened a door he had kept closed for years. You said she's still nearby? Daniel asked. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. We moved a few times, but we live close now. Daniel's mind was already moving, piecing things together, connecting timelines he had long stopped thinking about. "How long have you been out of school?" he asked. "A few weeks," Annie answered. "Just until we can pay again." Daniel glanced at the notice on the gate, then back at her. Emily watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at Annie once more, really looked this time. Then, slowly, Daniel reached up and removed the hiring notice from the gate. The paper crinkled softly in his hand. Annie's eyes widened slightly. Daniel looked down at her. "You're right about one thing," he said. She waited. "You don't need charity." "Then, come inside," Daniel said. His voice was calm, but different now. "Let's talk about that chance." Daniel Carter did not speak again until the door closed behind them. The warmth of the house wrapped around Annie almost instantly, a stark contrast to the biting cold she had just stepped out of. The floors were polished dark wood, the air faintly scented with coffee and something freshly baked. It was the kind of home that felt quiet not because it was empty but because everything in it had a place. And nothing was out of order. Annie stood just inside the entryway, unsure where to go, her boots leaving small patches of melted snow on the floor. "It's all right," Emily said gently, stepping forward. "You can come in." Annie nodded, carefully wiping her feet against the mat as best as she could before stepping further inside. Her movements were cautious, measured as if she had already decided she must not disturb anything. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the dining table. Annie hesitated, then climbed onto the edge of the seat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Emily disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned with a small bowl of warm oatmeal and a glass of milk. She placed them gently in front of Annie. "You should eat something," she said. Annie looked at the food, then at Emily. "Thank you," she said softly. She didn't reach for it immediately. Daniel noticed that. "Go ahead," he said. Only then did Annie pick up the spoon. She ate slowly, not like a hungry child rushing through a meal, but carefully, deliberately, as if each bite mattered. Daniel leaned lightly against the table, arms crossed. "You said your mother is Lena Brooks," he said. Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." "She worked in accounting," Daniel continued, more to himself than to her. "Stayed late more than she needed to, always double-checking numbers no one else caught." Annie looked up, surprised. "You remember her?" Daniel didn't answer right away. "I remember a lot of people," he said finally. Emily glanced at him, but said nothing. Annie lowered her gaze back to the bowl. "She still talks about that job," she said. "She said it was the best place she ever worked." Daniel shifted slightly. "When the company closed," Annie continued, "she thought she would find something else fast. But it didn't happen that way. She never complained," Annie added. "Not in front of me." Emily sat down across from her, her expression softening. "And you think working will fix that?" she asked gently. Annie nodded. "I can help," she said. "Even a little is still something." Daniel pushed himself off the table and walked a few steps toward the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. He had heard this before. Not from a child, but from grown men and women who had once depended on him. "We'll make it work. We just need time. We'll figure something out." And he had believed them, until everything fell apart. "You're not going to work here," Daniel said. Annie's hand paused slightly over the bowl. Emily looked at him. "Daniel." He turned back. "No," he said, more firmly now. "She's 6. This isn't a discussion." Annie lowered the spoon slowly. "I can do small things," she said quietly. "I won't be in the way." "That's not the point," Daniel replied. He walked back toward the table, stopping just a few feet from her. "You're not supposed to be working," he said. "You're supposed to be learning, growing, being a child." Annie looked up at him. "I can do both." Daniel shook his head. "No, you can't. Not like this." A silence followed. Annie's fingers tightened slightly around the spoon. "If I don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "then I can't go back." If this moment touched your heart and made you think about the strength hidden in the smallest voices, take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, just enough to reveal the weight of the moment. "You said it's only been a few weeks," he said. "Yes, sir. And your mother doesn't know you're here?" Annie hesitated. "She knows I want to help. That's not what I asked." Another pause. "No," she admitted. Daniel nodded once. "That's exactly why you won't be working here." Annie's gaze dropped. "You don't fix a situation like this by putting more weight on your shoulders," Daniel continued. "That's not how it works. It is for us," she said quietly. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel sighed, running a hand lightly along the back of the chair. "I've seen this before," he said. "People trying to carry things they shouldn't have to carry." He glanced at Emily. "And it doesn't end well." Emily met his eyes. "Sometimes it does," she said softly. Daniel didn't respond. He looked back at Annie. "You asked for a chance," he said, "and I'm giving you an answer." Annie nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Emily reached across the table, placing a gentle hand over Annie's. "Finish eating," she said quietly. Annie nodded again and lifted the spoon. Daniel did not return to his office that morning. That alone would have surprised anyone who worked for him. For years, his routine had been precise, unchanging. Mornings began with meetings, numbers, projections, every decision mapped out before the day even started. There was comfort in that structure, control. But now, he stood near the large window in the sitting room, looking out at the snow-covered street, seeing nothing of it. Behind him, Annie had finished eating. She carefully placed the spoon back into the bowl, making sure it didn't clatter. Then she slid off the chair, her small boots touching the polished floor as quietly as possible. "Thank you for the food," she said. Emily smiled gently. "You're welcome." Annie turned slightly toward Daniel. Waiting. Not asking. Waiting. Daniel noticed. That patience again. He turned from the window. "I'll take you home," he said. Annie shook her head quickly. "I can walk." "It's too far," Emily said softly. Annie hesitated, then nodded once. "Okay." Daniel reached for his coat, pulling it on with the same controlled motion he always used. But there was a slight delay this time, just enough to suggest his thoughts were somewhere else. "Where do you live?" he asked. Annie told him. The address was closer than he expected. Much closer. Daniel paused for a fraction of a second before nodding. "All right." The drive was quiet. Annie sat in the back seat, her hands folded in her lap, looking out the window as the car moved through streets that slowly changed from wide, clean avenues lined with large homes to narrower roads, older buildings, signs of wear that grew more visible with every block. Daniel watched it all through the rearview mirror. He hadn't driven through this part of the city in years. Not since. He stopped that thought before it could finish. "Does your mother work now?" he asked. Annie kept her eyes on the window. "Yes, sir." "What does she do?" "She cleans offices, sometimes houses, whatever she can find." Daniel nodded slowly. "And she doesn't know you came to see me?" "No, sir." Another pause. "She wouldn't like it," Annie added quietly. Daniel didn't ask why. He already knew. The car slowed. As they reached a small apartment building, the paint on the exterior had faded, and the steps leading up to the entrance showed signs of years of use. Not broken, but worn. "This is it," Annie said. The driver pulled to a stop. Daniel stepped out first, the cold air returning sharply around him. He walked around the car and opened the back door. Annie climbed out carefully. "Thank you for the ride," she said. Daniel looked at the building, then at her. "You shouldn't go around asking strangers for work," he said. Annie nodded. "I know." "Then why did you?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I ran out of options." The words landed without weight. No drama, just truth. Daniel studied her for a moment longer. Then he looked toward the building again. "Go inside," he said. Annie nodded. But before she turned, she stopped. "Sir?" Daniel waited. "I meant what I said," she added. "About working." "I know," he replied. She held his gaze for a second longer. Then she turned and walked toward the building, her small figure moving steadily up the worn steps and through the door. Daniel didn't leave right away. He stood there, looking at the entrance long after it had closed behind her. Something about it didn't sit right. Not the building, not the neighborhood, but the distance. How had they ended up this close? Without him ever knowing. "Mr. Carter?" the driver called gently. Daniel turned, then got back into the car. "Office?" the driver asked. Daniel paused, then shook his head. "No." He looked back at the building one last time. "Take me to the old site." The driver didn't question it. The car pulled away, leaving the quiet street behind. It took less than 15 minutes. The building that had once housed Carter Tech Solutions still stood but barely resembled what it had been. The glass exterior had been replaced in parts, signage removed, the name gone as if it had never existed. Time had moved on. Daniel stepped out of the car slowly. For a moment, he just stood there. This place had once been everything. Long nights, big ideas, people who believed in something they were building together, and then, gone. He walked toward the entrance, his shoes echoing faintly against the pavement. Inside, the lobby had changed. Different colors, different layout, different people, but memory had a way of filling in what reality erased. He could still see it. Desks lined in rows, voices overlapping. Lena Brooks sitting at the far end, papers spread neatly in front of her, always the last one to leave. He remembered the day things started falling apart, the meetings, the decisions, the moment he realized he couldn't hold it together anymore, and the people who paid the price for that. Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned away and walked back outside. The cold hit him again, but this time, he didn't seem to notice, because something had shifted. Not in the world, in him. That little girl hadn't asked for money. She hadn't asked for pity. She had asked for something far more difficult. A chance. And he had said no. Daniel looked back at the building one last time, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts briefly, then stopped. A name. One he hadn't called in years. He pressed it. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then, "Hello?" Daniel didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was steady. "I need you to find someone," he said. A pause on the other end. "Who?" Daniel looked out across the street, his gaze distant. "Lena Brooks." Another pause. "That name sounds familiar." "It should," Daniel replied quietly. "She used to work for me." The wind moved lightly around him. "And I think," he added, "it's time I found out what happened after I stopped looking." He ended the call, then stood there, still for a moment. Because for the first time in years, Daniel Carter wasn't thinking about what he had built. He was thinking about what he had left behind. And somewhere, in a small apartment not far from where he stood, a 6-year-old girl was still trying to earn her way back to school, without knowing that her story had just reopened his. Daniel didn't go home that afternoon. He stayed in the car longer than usual, watching the city pass by through the tinted window, as if he were seeing it for the first time. Buildings he had helped shape, streets he had driven 1,000 times without noticing, lives moving forward quietly, steadily without him ever needing to look too closely. But now he was looking. And once you started seeing, it was hard to stop. "Mr. Carter," his driver said carefully, glancing at him through the mirror. "Where to next?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. His phone rested in his hand, the call he had made earlier still lingering in his mind. He hadn't reached out like that in years. Not to revisit the past, not to reopen doors that had taken so much effort to close. But Annie's voice had changed something. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. "Take me back to the house," Daniel said finally. The car turned smoothly, heading back toward the quiet, ordered part of the city he had always preferred. When he stepped inside, the warmth felt different than it had that morning. Not comforting, just still. Emily was in the living room, seated near the window with a book resting in her lap, though it was clear she hadn't been reading. She looked up as he entered. "You didn't go to the office," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel removed his coat slowly. "No." She studied him for a moment. "That's new." He didn't respond. Emily closed the book and set it aside. "Did you take her home?" "Yes." "And?" Daniel walked past her, stopping near the fireplace. The flames moved softly behind the glass, steady and controlled like everything else in the house. "She lives 10 minutes from here," he said. Emily frowned slightly. "That close?" He nodded. Silence settled between them for a moment. "She told me about her mother," Daniel added. Emily's expression shifted. "And?" "Lena Brooks." Emily inhaled sharply. "Oh." She leaned back slightly, processing it. "I remember her," she said. "She was loyal, quiet, always working." Daniel nodded. "She stayed when others left," he said. "Longer than she should have." Emily looked at him carefully. "And then?" Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly. "Then the company collapsed." The words were simple, but they carried years behind them. Emily didn't interrupt. "She lost her job," Daniel continued. "And I never followed up, never checked what happened to her after that." He paused. "I told myself there were too many people, too many situations, that I couldn't fix everything." Emily stood slowly, walking closer. "And now?" Daniel looked down, his voice quieter. "Now her 6-year-old daughter is standing outside my gate asking for work, so she can go back to school." The room felt heavier after that. Emily didn't speak right away, because there was nothing easy to say. "Daniel," she began gently, "you didn't cause all of this." He looked up at her. "Didn't I?" The question wasn't defensive, it was honest. Emily held his gaze. "You didn't choose for the company to fail," she said. "You didn't choose for people to struggle afterward." "No," Daniel replied, "but I chose not to look back." That landed. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. There it was. Not guilt, responsibility. And those two things were not the same. The sound of a phone vibrating broke the silence. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled it out. A message. He read it quickly. Then again. Emily watched him. "What is it?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the window, staring out at the fading light of the afternoon. "She moved 3 times in the past 4 years, he said. "Short-term jobs, no stable income, no support system." Emily closed her eyes briefly. "And Annie?" "Out of school for 3 weeks, Daniel replied. "Fees unpaid." The words were factual, precise. But something underneath them had changed. Emily stepped closer. "So what are you going to do?" Daniel didn't answer. Not right away. Because for the first time in a long time, this wasn't about strategy, or profit, or risk. This was about something far more complicated. Choice. "I already told her no," he said. Emily nodded. "I know, but she didn't argue," he added. Emily looked at him again. "No," she said softly. She didn't seem like the kind who would. Daniel turned from the window. "She accepted it," he said. Like she's used to hearing it. That bothered him more than he expected. Because no 6-year-old should sound like that. Emily folded her arms gently. "She's not asking for help," she said. "She's asking for dignity." Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. That word. Dignity. It lingered. "She doesn't want to owe anyone," he said. Emily nodded. "Then don't make her feel like she does." The room fell quiet again. Daniel walked slowly toward his desk, resting his hand against the edge of it. For years, every decision he made had been calculated, measured, predictable. But this wasn't something you could solve with numbers. "You said before," Emily continued carefully, "that you've seen this situation too many times." Daniel didn't look up. "I have. And how many of those times," she asked, "did you actually stop and look this closely?" That question stayed in the air. Daniel didn't answer. Because he knew the truth. Not many. Maybe none. The past had always been something to move past, not something to return to. But Annie had changed that, without even trying. Daniel straightened slightly, his expression settling not into indifference, but into something more focused. "What time is it?" he asked. Emily glanced at the clock. "Almost 5. Daniel nodded once. "School offices close around 6, he said. Emily watched him carefully. "Daniel," he picked up his coat again. "I told her she couldn't work here," he said. Emily waited. "And I meant it." A pause. Then, but that doesn't mean she doesn't get a chance. Emily's expression softened, not relief, understanding. Daniel moved toward the door. This isn't about giving her a job, he added. It's about fixing what should never have been broken. He stopped briefly, his hand on the door. Then said, more quietly, or at least, trying to. Emily didn't stop him, because she knew. This was the first real step he had taken towards something he had avoided for years. And as Daniel Carter stepped back out into the cold evening air, he wasn't just going to see a little girl anymore. He was going to face a part of his past that had finally come back to ask him for one thing. Not money, not apologies, just one chance. Daniel arrived at the school just before sunset. The building stood quiet at the end of a tree-lined street, its red brick walls catching the last fading light of the day. A flag hung still near the entrance, unmoving in the cold air. Most of the windows were dark, but a few lights remained on inside signs that not everyone had gone home yet. He stepped out of the car and paused for a moment, looking at the name engraved on the stone sign near the gate. It wasn't a prestigious school, not one of the elite institutions his peers sent their children to. But it was clean, orderly, honest. The kind of place where effort still meant something. Daniel walked up the steps and pushed open the front door. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint scent of paper, chalk, and something cooked earlier in the day. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with bulletin boards displaying children's drawings, bright colors, uneven lines, hopeful messages written in careful handwriting. He slowed his pace without realizing it. A drawing caught his eye. A small house. A sun in the corner. Two figures holding hands. Simple. Certain. He looked away. "Can I help you?" The voice came from down the hall. A woman approached, carrying a stack of papers in her arms. She was likely in her late 50s, her expression alert but not unkind. Years of experience showed in the way she carried herself, firm, but patient. "I'm looking for information about a student," Daniel said. The woman stopped a few feet from him. "School's closed," she replied. "You'll need to come back during office hours." Daniel reached into his coat and handed her a card. She glanced at it, then looked up again, this time with recognition. "Oh," she said. "Mr. Carter." Her tone shifted slightly. "Yes," Daniel said. "I won't take much of your time." The woman adjusted the papers in her arms. "What is this about?" "A student named Annie Brooks," he said. "She was enrolled here." The woman's expression changed again, not surprise, concern. "She hasn't been in class for a few weeks," she said. "I know." The woman studied him more carefully now. "And you are?" Daniel hesitated for a brief second, then answered simply, "I'm trying to help." That wasn't the full truth. But it wasn't a lie either. The woman considered him, then nodded slightly. "Come with me." She led him down the hallway into a small office. It was modest files neatly stacked, a worn desk, a single window looking out onto the playground where snow had settled over empty swings. She set the papers down and took a seat, motioning for him to do the same. "I'm Mrs. Patterson," she said. "Vice principal." Daniel sat. "I understand Annie has been absent," he said. Mrs. Patterson folded her hands. "She's a good student," she said. "Quiet, focused, always prepared. That's not something we see every day at her age." Daniel listened. "She stopped coming without much explanation," the woman continued. "We reached out, but..." She paused. There was no response. Daniel nodded slowly. "Her mother is having financial difficulties," he said. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "Yes," she said. "We suspected as much." She leaned back in her chair. "It happens more often than people think," she added. "Families fall behind. Fees go unpaid. Children disappear from classrooms." Daniel's jaw tightened faintly. "And what happens then?" he asked. Mrs. Patterson met his gaze. "We try," she said. "We offer support where we can, payment plans, assistance programs, but there are limits. Limits." Daniel knew that word well. "And Annie?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "She didn't ask for help," she said. "Not once." That didn't surprise him. "She stopped coming instead." Mrs. Patterson continued. That usually means the family has already decided they can't keep up. Daniel looked toward the window, his eyes resting briefly on the empty playground. She wants to come back, he said. Mrs. Patterson nodded. I believe that. Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Daniel reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the desk. I'd like to cover her fees, he said. Mrs. Patterson didn't touch it. Instead, she looked at him carefully. That's generous, she said, but it's not always that simple. Daniel's gaze returned to her. What do you mean? She's 6, Mrs. Patterson replied. At that age, it's not just about tuition. It's about stability, attendance, support at home. Daniel said nothing. If she comes back, the woman continued, we need to know she can stay. Not just for a week. Not just until the next bill arrives. Daniel leaned back slightly. That won't be an issue. Mrs. Patterson held his gaze. And her mother? Another pause. That's being handled, Daniel said. The words came out more certain than he felt. Mrs. Patterson studied him for a moment longer. Then, slowly, she reached for the envelope. I'll reopen her file, she said. But I want to be clear about something, Mr. Carter. Daniel waited. This can't feel like charity to her, she said. Children like Annie, they notice those things. Daniel nodded once. I understand. But even as he said it, he knew that understanding something and doing it right were not always the same. Mrs. Patterson stood. I'll contact her mother tomorrow, she said. Daniel rose as well. Thank you. She walked him to the door. As he stepped back into the hallway, his eyes drifted once more to the drawings on the wall. Bright colors, simple dreams, uncomplicated futures, things that should have been guaranteed, but weren't. When he stepped outside, the air had grown colder. The sky had darkened, and the first streetlights flickered on. Daniel paused at the top of the steps, looking out across the quiet street. He had taken the first step, paid the fees, opened the door. But something still didn't sit right. Because deep down, he knew Annie wouldn't see it the way he did, not as help, not as opportunity, but as something she hadn't asked for. And if he wasn't careful, he would lose her trust before he ever truly earned it. Daniel stepped into the car. Home? The driver asked. Daniel looked out the window, his expression distant. No, he said quietly. Take me back to her, because this time, he wasn't just going to fix the problem, he was going to do it the right way. Daniel arrived just as the hallway lights inside the apartment building flickered on. Evening had settled fully now. The cold felt heavier, sharper than before, and the quiet of the neighborhood carried a different weight than the one he had left behind in his part of the city. Here, the silence wasn't polished, it was worn, lived in, carrying the sound of distant footsteps, muffled voices, doors opening and closing behind thin walls. He stepped out of the car and told the driver to wait. For a moment, he stood there again, looking up at the same building Annie had disappeared into earlier that day. Nothing about it had changed, but something in him had. He walked toward the entrance, each step slower than the last. Not out of hesitation, but out of something closer to awareness. This wasn't a boardroom. There was no script for this kind of conversation. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. The lights hummed softly overhead. A narrow staircase led upward, its steps creaking slightly under his weight as he climbed. Second floor, apartment 2B. He paused in front of the door. For a man who had negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without blinking, knocking on that door felt different. Then he raised his hand and knocked. There was movement inside, a soft shuffle. Then the door opened. The woman standing there froze. She looked older than he remembered, not in a way that spoke of time alone, but of weight carried over years. Her hair was pulled back simply, her clothes clean but worn, and her eyes, they recognized him instantly. Mr. Carter? Her voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel held her gaze. Lena. The name settled between them like something fragile. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lena stepped back slightly, still holding the door. She began, then stopped. Please, come in. Daniel stepped inside. The apartment was small, but tidy. Everything had a place. A couch near the wall, A small table with 2 chairs. A narrow shelf with neatly stacked books. There was no excess, but there was care. Annie sat at the table, a pencil in her hand, a notebook open in front of her. She looked up. Surprise flashed across her face. "Sir?" Daniel nodded once. "I needed to speak with your mother." Annie looked between them, then quietly set her pencil down. "I'll go to my room," she said. Lena touched her shoulder gently. "No," she said softly. "You can stay." Annie hesitated, then remained where she was, watching. Lena turned back to Daniel. "I didn't expect," she began, then shook her head slightly. "It's been a long time." "Yes," Daniel said. Another pause. Then Lena straightened just a little, her voice steadying. "What can I do for you?" The question was polite, respectful, but there was distance in it, Daniel noticed. "I saw Annie this morning," he said. Lena's expression changed instantly. "What?" "She came to my house," he continued, "asking for work." Lena closed her eyes briefly, her hand tightening slightly at her side. "I told her not to do that," she said quietly. "She didn't mention that," Daniel replied. Lena let out a slow breath. "She wouldn't," she said. "She doesn't like to make things harder for me." Daniel glanced at Annie. She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," Lena said, turning back to him. "She shouldn't have gone there. I didn't come here for an apology." Daniel interrupted gently. Lena stopped. Silence followed. Daniel took a step forward, his voice quieter now. "I went to her school." Lena's eyes lifted again, sharper this time. "You did what?" "She's been out for 3 weeks," Daniel said. "Unpaid fees." Lena didn't respond immediately. Her posture shifted subtly, but noticeably. A kind of quiet defense. "That's my responsibility," she said. "I know. I'm handling it." Daniel studied her. "How?" Lena hesitated. "I'll figure it out," she said. The words were familiar, too familiar. Daniel had heard them before. From her, from others, from himself. "I've already covered the fees," he said. The room went still. Annie looked up. Lena didn't move. "You what?" she asked. "I paid the outstanding balance," Daniel said. "She can return to school." For a brief moment, something flickered in Lena's eyes. Relief. Then, it was gone. "No," she said. Daniel blinked. "No, I didn't ask for that," Lena continued, her voice calm but firm, "and Annie didn't either." Annie looked between them, unsure. "It's done," Daniel said. "That doesn't make it right," Lena replied. The tension in the room shifted. Not anger. Not exactly. Something deeper. Daniel frowned slightly. "She deserves to be in school." "She does," Lena agreed. "But not like that." Daniel's expression hardened just a fraction. "What does that mean?" "It means," Lena said, choosing her words carefully, "that I won't have my daughter thinking she needs someone else to fix her life." Daniel looked at Annie again. "She already believes that she has to fix it herself," he said. Lena didn't deny it. "That's because she sees me trying," Lena replied, not giving up. A silence followed. Annie sat very still, listening, learning. Daniel stepped closer. "This isn't charity," he said. Lena met his gaze. "Then, what is it?" Daniel paused, because the answer mattered. "It's a chance," he said. Lena's expression didn't change. "No," she replied softly. "A chance is something you earn." Daniel shook his head slightly. "Not always." "Yes," Lena said. "For us, it is." That landed, deep, because it wasn't just about money or school. It was about something else. Pride. Dignity. The right to stand without feeling owned. Daniel looked at Annie. She was watching him carefully, not hopeful, not afraid, just waiting. He understood then. This wasn't something he could solve the way he was used to. He couldn't just write a check. He had to do it differently. "I won't take it back," he said quietly. Lena didn't respond. "But I won't force it either," he added. That made her pause. "What does that mean?" she asked. Daniel looked at Annie, then back at Lena. It means she goes back to school, he said, but not because I paid for it. Lena frowned slightly. Then how? Daniel took a breath. We figure out a way, he said. That makes it hers. Silence settled again. But this time, it felt different. Not closed, not final, open. For the first time since he had walked through the door, Lena didn't push back immediately, and Annie, for the first time, looked at him with something new in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but maybe, the beginning of it. Daniel didn't leave immediately. The apartment remained quiet after his last words. But it was no longer the same silence. Something had shifted, subtle, but real. The kind of shift that didn't resolve anything yet, but made it impossible to go back to where things had been. Lena stood near the small kitchen counter, her arms loosely folded, her posture no longer defensive but not open either. She was thinking, measuring, weighing every word he had said. Annie sat at the table, her pencil untouched now, her attention fixed entirely on the two adults in front of her. Daniel understood something clearly in that moment. Whatever happened next, she would remember it. Not just the outcome, but how it was done. How do you plan to do that? Lena asked finally. Her voice was calm, but direct. Daniel didn't answer right away. Because for once, he didn't have a complete solution prepared. I don't know yet, he admitted. That alone made Lena's expression change just slightly. Men like Daniel Carter didn't usually say those words. But I do know this, he continued. It can't feel like she owes me, and it can't take away what you've been trying to teach her. Lena looked at Annie, then back at him. She's learning to stand on her own, Lena said. That matters more than anything. I agree, Daniel said. Then don't take that from her. I'm not trying to. Another pause. Annie shifted slightly in her chair. What if... she began, then stopped. Both adults looked at her. She hesitated under their attention, but then continued. What if I still work? Daniel frowned slightly. No, he said immediately. Annie looked down. Not like before, she added quickly. Not a real job. Daniel didn't respond yet. I can help, she said. Small things, after school, or weekends. Lena's eyes softened, but she didn't interrupt. I don't need a lot, Annie continued. Just enough so it feels like I did something. Daniel studied her carefully. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about ownership. About not feeling carried. You're 6, he said. I know, Annie replied, and that's exactly why you shouldn't be working. I'm not trying to work like a grown-up, she said. I just don't want it to feel like it came from nowhere. That stopped him, because she had just put into words something most adults struggled to explain. Lena let out a quiet breath. She gets that from me, she said softly. Daniel glanced at her. I figured. Silence settled again. But this time, it felt like something was forming. Not a solution yet, but the shape of one. Daniel walked slowly across the room, his eyes drifting over the small details, the neatly stacked books, the repaired edge of the table, the careful order of a life built with limited means but steady hands. Nothing here was careless. Nothing here was given lightly. When he turned back, his expression had changed. Not softer, clearer. What if it's not a job? He said. Lena raised an eyebrow slightly. Then what is it? Daniel looked at Annie. A responsibility, he answered. Annie tilted her head. What kind? Daniel took a moment before replying. The kind that belongs to you, he said. Something you can take pride in. Something that doesn't break the rules, but still lets you earn your place. Lena watched him closely. And what would that look like? Daniel exhaled slowly. At the house, he said. Not working. Not hired. Annie leaned forward just slightly. But helping? Daniel nodded once. Helping, he confirmed. In ways that are safe. Small. Appropriate for your age. Annie's eyes brightened, but she didn't smile. Not yet. And in return? Lena asked. Daniel met her gaze. In return, she commits to school, he said. Fully. No gaps. No stopping. Lena considered that. And the money? It's not payment, Daniel said. It's structure. Support tied to effort. Not handed over, but built with her. Lena didn't answer immediately. She looked at Annie again. You understand what that means? She asked. Annie nodded slowly. I have to keep going, she said. Yes, Lena replied, even when it's hard. Annie nodded again. I can do that. Daniel watched her. There was no doubt in her voice. Only certainty. Lena turned back to him. And if she fails? She asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. Then we adjust, he said. We don't abandon it. That answer mattered. Because it wasn't about perfection. It was about commitment. Lena's shoulders lowered slightly. Not in surrender. In acceptance. I won't have her feeling like she owes you, she said. She won't, Daniel replied. I mean it. So do I. Another silence. But this one felt settled. Lena walked over to the table and placed a hand gently on Annie's shoulder. You're sure about this? She asked. Annie looked up at her. Yes. Lena nodded once, then looked at Daniel. All right. The word was quiet, but it carried weight. Daniel inclined his head slightly. Then we start tomorrow, he said. Annie blinked. Tomorrow? Daniel allowed the faintest hint of a smile. School comes first, he said. We'll take care of the rest after that. Annie nodded, gripping the edge of the table slightly tighter. Not out of fear, out of readiness. Daniel turned toward the door, then paused. One more thing, he said. Lena looked at him. This only works if we're honest, he continued. No hiding problems. No pretending things are fine when they're not. Lena met his gaze steadily. I've been honest this whole time, she said. Daniel nodded. I know. He opened the door, the cold air slipping in once more. But it didn't feel as sharp as before. Because something had changed. Not just in the situation. In the direction. As he stepped out into the night, Daniel realized something he hadn't expected. This wasn't about fixing a mistake anymore. It was about building something new. Something that didn't erase the past, but didn't let it decide everything either. And behind him, inside that small apartment, a 6-year-old girl sat a little straighter. Not because her life had been solved, but because, for the first time, she had been given something real. Not charity. Not pity. A chance she could stand on. The next morning began earlier than usual for Daniel Carter. Not because of a meeting. Not because of a deadline, but because for the first time in a long time, there was something waiting for him that didn't belong on a calendar. He stood by the window, coffee untouched in his hand, watching the pale light of dawn stretch across the quiet street. The snow from the night before had settled into a smooth, untouched surface again, clean, undisturbed, like a blank page. Behind him, Emily entered the room. You're up early, she said gently. Daniel didn't turn right away. I have somewhere to be, he replied. Emily studied him for a moment. Not the office? No, that alone told her enough. She walked closer, resting her hand lightly on the back of a chair. You're thinking about her, Daniel finally turned. Yes, Emily nodded slightly. She'll remember today, she said. Daniel held her gaze. I know, and that was exactly why he couldn't approach it the way he approached everything else. No shortcuts, no assumptions, no control disguised as help. Just clarity. By the time the car pulled up in front of the apartment building, the sun had risen fully, casting a pale winter light across the street. Annie was already outside. She stood near the entrance, a small backpack slung over her shoulders, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat to keep warm. She wasn't moving around to stay warm. She wasn't fidgeting. She was waiting. Daniel stepped out of the car. You're early, he said. Annie nodded. I didn't want to be late. For what? For the chance. The answer came simply. Daniel studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. Lena stepped out behind her, pulling her coat tighter around herself. I'll walk her to school, she said. Daniel shook his head. I'll take her. Lena hesitated. That's not necessary. It's not about necessity, Daniel replied. It's about starting this the right way. Lena looked at Annie. Annie looked back. Then Lena nodded once. Annie walked toward the car. But before getting in, she turned back to her mother. "I'll be back after school," she said. "I know," Lena replied softly. "Then I'll go there." Lena understood what she meant. "After school," she confirmed. "Not before." Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." That mattered. Daniel noticed. Respect. Structure. Not forced. Taught. The drive to the school was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Annie sat in the back, her backpack resting neatly on her lap. She didn't look out the window this time. She looked forward, focused. "You know what today is?" Daniel asked after a while. "My first day back," Annie answered. "That's part of it." She tilted her head slightly. "What else?" Daniel glanced at her through the mirror. "It's the day you prove something." Annie frowned just a little. "To who?" Daniel paused, then answered carefully. "To yourself." She thought about that, then nodded. "I can do that." Daniel believed her. When they arrived, the school entrance was already busy with children and parents moving in and out. Voices overlapping, laughter mixing with the sharp morning air. Annie stepped out of the car and adjusted her backpack. She didn't rush forward. She stood still for a second, taking it in. Then she turned to Daniel. "I'll go in now," she said. Daniel stepped closer. "Wait." She stopped. "There's something you need to understand," he said. Annie looked up at him. "This isn't something I gave you," he continued, "and it's not something you owe me for." Annie listened carefully. "This is something you're stepping into," he said, "because you chose to." She nodded slowly. "I know." Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer. "Good." Annie turned and walked toward the entrance, step by step. This time, her steps were different. Not uncertain. Not hesitant. Intentional. Daniel watched until she disappeared inside. Only then did he turn away. But instead of getting back into the car, he stayed, watching the doors, watching the flow of people, because something about this moment felt important. Not big, not dramatic, but real. And real things mattered more than anything he had built. The school doors opened again a few minutes later. A teacher stepped out briefly, scanning the crowd, then disappeared back inside. Life moved on, as it always did, but Daniel didn't leave. Not yet, because he knew this was only the first step, and the harder part hadn't even begun. Later that afternoon, when the school day ended, Annie walked out with the other children. But she didn't run, didn't rush. She walked with the same steady pace she had shown the day before. Daniel was waiting near the curb. She spotted him almost immediately, and this time, she smiled. Not wide, not carefree, but real. "I stayed the whole day," she said. Daniel nodded. "I expected that." Annie shifted her backpack slightly. "I didn't forget anything," she added. "And I answered questions." Daniel allowed the faintest hint of approval to show. "Good." She looked up at him. "So, now what?" Daniel glanced toward the car. "Now," he said, "we begin the second part." Annie's expression grew serious again. "The part where I help," she said. "Yes." She nodded once. "I'm ready." Daniel opened the car door for her. As she climbed in, he realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't about changing her life overnight. It was about building something small, one day at a time, something steady enough to last. And as the car pulled away from the school, carrying them back toward a house that no longer felt quite the same, Daniel Carter understood one thing clearly. For the first time in years, he wasn't just rebuilding a company, he was rebuilding trust, and this time, he couldn't afford to fail. The drive back to Daniel's house felt shorter than the one that morning. Maybe because Annie wasn't looking out the window anymore. She sat upright, her backpack still on her lap, her hands resting over it as if she hadn't quite let go of the day yet. There was a quiet energy around her now, not excitement, not exactly, but something steadier. She had done what she said she would do, and she knew it. Daniel noticed it without turning. "You're thinking," he said. Annie nodded. "Yes, sir." "About what?" She hesitated for a moment. "About what comes next." Daniel allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "That's a good habit," he said. The car slowed as it approached the gates of the estate. The iron bars opened smoothly, revealing the long driveway ahead, lined with bare trees that stretched toward the house. Annie watched this time, not in awe, not in hesitation, but in observation. When the car stopped, Daniel stepped out first. Annie followed, her boots landing softly against the cleared stone path. She didn't wait to be told what to do. She turned toward him. "What should I start with?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her. The same girl who had stood outside the gate yesterday, cold, asking, now stood inside, warm, ready. That difference mattered. "First," he said, "you put your bag inside." Annie nodded and walked carefully up the steps, entering the house without rushing, without touching anything she didn't need to. Emily met her just inside the door. "You're back," she said gently. Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Emily smiled. "How was school?" Annie paused, just briefly. "Good," she said. "I didn't miss anything." Emily glanced toward Daniel, who had just stepped in behind her. "She's serious," Emily said quietly. "I know," Daniel replied. Annie placed her backpack neatly near the chair by the wall, making sure it didn't lean or fall. Then she turned back. "I'm ready," she said. Daniel motioned toward the kitchen. "Come with me." The kitchen was already in order, as it always was. Counters clean. Everything placed exactly where it belonged. There was no obvious work waiting. Annie noticed. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, searching. "What needs to be done?" she asked. Daniel leaned slightly against the counter. "That's the first thing you need to learn," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "Not all work is given to you," he said. "Some of it, you have to see for yourself." Annie turned back to the room. This time she looked more carefully. The sink was clean. The floor, spotless. The table, clear, nothing obvious. She frowned slightly. "There's nothing to do." Daniel shook his head. "Look again." Annie stepped further into the room. This time, slower, more deliberate. Her eyes moved differently now. Not just seeing, but examining. Then, she noticed it, a small stack of mail near the edge of the counter, slightly out of place. Not messy. Just not aligned. She walked over and adjusted it, straightening the edges carefully. Then, she stepped back. Daniel watched. "What else?" he asked. Annie glanced around again. A dish towel hanging slightly uneven. She fixed it. A chair not pushed in all the way. She corrected it. Small things, but intentional. When she was done, she turned back to him. "That's all I see." Daniel nodded once. "That's enough for today." Annie blinked. "That's it?" "For now." She hesitated. That didn't feel like work. Daniel walked a few steps closer. "That's because you're thinking about work the wrong way," he said. "It's not always about effort. Sometimes it's about attention." Annie considered that, then nodded slowly. "I understand." Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. He placed it on the table in front of her. "What's this?" she asked. "A record," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For what you do," he replied. "Every day." Annie picked up the notebook carefully, flipping it open. The pages were blank. "You write it down," Daniel said. "What you noticed, what you fixed, what you learned." Annie ran her fingers lightly over the paper. "Why?" Daniel's expression remained calm. "Because if you don't keep track of your effort," he said, "it starts to feel like it doesn't exist." That stayed with her. She nodded. "I'll write everything. I expect you to." Annie closed the notebook gently. There was a pause. Then, "Do I get paid?" she asked. The question wasn't greedy. It was direct. Daniel didn't react immediately. Instead, he leaned slightly against the table. "You get something," he said. Annie waited. "But not like a job," he continued. "Not for each task." She frowned slightly. "Then how?" Daniel met her gaze. "You earn consistency," he said. "And consistency earns trust." Annie didn't speak. She was trying to understand. "And when you've proven that, he added. Then we talk about the next step. A longer silence followed, then Annie nodded. Okay. She didn't argue, didn't push. She accepted the structure, because it felt real. Emily, who had been watching quietly from the doorway, stepped in. I think that's enough for the first day, she said gently. Annie looked at her. Yes, ma'am. Daniel glanced at the clock. Your mother will be expecting you. Annie nodded and picked up her notebook, holding it carefully against her chest. I'll come back tomorrow, she said. Daniel walked her to the door. I expect you to, he replied. Annie stepped outside, the cold air meeting her again, but this time, it didn't seem to bother her as much. She turned back once. Thank you, she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. Not yet, she understood. Then she nodded and walked down the steps, her figure moving steadily toward the street. Daniel remained at the doorway, watching her go. Emily stepped beside him. She's different, she said quietly. Daniel didn't take his eyes off Annie. Yes, not like the others you mentioned. Daniel finally looked away. No, he said. Then after a pause, she never asked for easy. The door closed softly behind them. And inside the house, something subtle had begun to take shape. Not a transaction, not a favor, but a foundation. One that would either hold or break, depending on what came next. The next day,